From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
America's most famous Catholic convert, Vice President J.D. Vance, has released a new book on his faith, Communion, Finding My Way Back to Faith. This week on Register Radio, we talked to Register Managing Editor Jonathan Liedl for a review. And then, as America celebrates our 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Register is also celebrating the immense contributions of Catholics to America's glorious past. Hello, I'm Matthew Bunson, Vice President, Editorial Director of EWTN News and host of Register Radio. My co-host, Shannon Mullen, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register, joins me as always, and we're together in studio. We haven't been for a couple weeks.
It's good to be back.
Well, I know that we want to take a little time today also to celebrate the Catholic Media Convention, the Catholic Media Awards. We'll do that right at the end, but let's make sure we touch on that because it was quite a turnout for us. But we're talking about J.D. Vance, and prior to his election to the U.S. Senate and, of course, becoming Vice President of the United States, Vance was the best-selling author of Hillbilly Elegy, a rather deeply personal account of his youth and spiritual journey. Vance is, let's just say, very famously converted to Catholicism in 2019. His new book, as I mentioned, Communion, Finding My Way Back to Faith, explores what it means to be a Christian and how it shapes or should shape every facet of life. Jonathan Liedl has read the book and is here with his review. Jonathan, welcome back to Register Radio.
Great to be with you.
So it's not unheard of for politicians to write memoirs or books in general. Does this one stand out as somewhat unique, though, in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, it really strikes me, Matthew, that this is a spiritual memoir, right? Obviously, J.D. Vance is the vice president. He's the expected presumptive Republican nominee for president in 2028. So it's really striking to me that sort of the book he chooses to write in the advent of all of that is so focused on faith, both personal, his own journey, growing up as an evangelical Protestant, losing faith and then coming back to it as a Catholic, but also, I think, really crucially and interesting, his thoughts about faith's role in society, culture, and civilization, and what that might suggest for his own sort of political vision going forward. So it's very, I mean, he could have framed this book in all kinds of different ways, right? But it is very unapologetically about faith, about Christianity, and why that matters. So that struck me as very interesting.
Jonathan, you've followed J.D. Vance over these past few years. You've written about him as a vice presidential candidate, about his post-liberal or post-liberalism and his views towards that, and some of his clashes with the Pope and the bishops and so forth. So I wanted to know just quickly, is there something or one or two things that you learned from reading this book that you didn't know about him already?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely some rich details in terms of his biography. I mean, I was really struck to learn that actually one of the episodes that he points to as the beginning of his faith kind of unraveling actually had to do with the Terry Schiavo case back around 2005. At that time, and just for context, Terry Schiavo, of course, was a young woman in Florida who was on a feeding tube, and there was a big debate about whether that tube could be removed by her husband. Her family wanted it kept, and it was really in the national spotlight. And for Vance at the time, his grandma had just died, his mother had relapsed with drugs, and at his church, his local church in Ohio, all anyone wanted to talk about was Terry Schiavo. And so he really, looking back on his attitude, then he said it was a little immature, but he felt like that focus on the cultural issues and maybe not the bread and butter difficulties that people in that community facing was really an impactful moment that kind of steered him away from the faith. Another thing that's interesting, though, is what prompted him to come back to the faith. And I think this is like a major theme of the book, is that Vance says, it wasn't that he had an epiphany and, the divinity of Christ was like cemented in his mind. Instead, it was the fruits of Christianity. And really, when the birth of his first son, Ewan, happened, he was terrified of being a bad father. And he looked around at people who were good fathers. He looked around at sources of virtue and morality, and he saw that they were all connected to Christianity. And so it's very personal in this. He's an intellectual guy. He's a smart guy, philosophical guy, but very much it was personal driven, I think, this journey back to faith for him.
Yeah, you mentioned the passing of some of his relatives, his mother's problems with addiction. How similar is this? Because we read a lot about this in the Hillbilly Elegy. How would you compare and contrast that book, which was something of a phenomenon, to this one?
Yeah, I think Hillbilly Elegy, written in 2016, it was really looking at sort of the demise of, white working class people in the Rust Belt. And Vance at that time, he hadn't converted to Catholicism. He still had some, I would say, libertarian commitments in his economic outlook. But I think something that shifted for him, and he's written about this before and talked about it before, is a recognition that the society we're in, the culture we're in, really sort of plays a profound role in shaping, what people do, what their options are, how they live their lives. So I think what's shifting here for Vance is I think he's really taking a look at a broad cultural perspective and coming to the conclusion that Christianity, I mean, he says that Christianity is America's creed, and you need that centered in a prominent public way. Not that everyone needs to be a Christian in order for there to be the kind of healthy communities around. He says without that, of course, that's what leads to family breakdown, drug addiction, all these things that he experienced growing up. But I think there's a shift here for Vance in thinking about what's the solution to many of those problems that plague middle America. It's a very robust account of religion and its public place is the conclusion he comes to.
Related to what you just said, Jonathan, the book's title, Communion, applies to that, right? It has multiple meanings. How so in the more political sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Vance, we talked about how he's interested in the fruits of Christianity. That's on a personal level, but it's also on a civilizational level. So towards the end of the book, he starts taking a look at where America's at and how, the Christian faith might relate to that. For instance, he talks about the declining fertility rate, right? And he says, if you've removed sort of a recognition that life is good, which you're not going to get from, a secular, elitist, striving economic viewpoint, right? You're not going to see the value of human life because it's not something that can be measured like the GDP. So he says that it's only sort of a religious culture that is going to sort of generate an openness to life that is going to, fix something, correct something like America's declining fertility rate. So that's one big example. Another thing he points to is, the rise of division in the United States along racial lines, along political lines, along economic lines. And I think he really sees that Christianity, because it's about being united in something higher than one's, race or class or things like that, is really capable of fostering that kind of communion at a broader level. So again, I think he's, the key distinction, I think, between him and maybe some Catholic thinkers in public life that were prominent maybe 20 years ago is I think Vance thinks that the government, or at least on this public level, there needs to be, this stuff needs to be promoted, right, in maybe a more forceful way. So I think that he really sees Christianity as sort of the driving heartbeat of achieving communion on a national level, which is very interesting.
Yeah, you note that he has a very clear view of Christianity in politics, Christianity and its role in public life and the life of the country. How would you describe this book, though, as also, obviously we're all Catholic Christians, but how Catholic is this book?
Yeah, it's interesting because there has been a lot of criticism, beginning with the front cover of the book, which is, I think, a Pentecostal church somewhere in rural Virginia. And so the question is, is how Catholic is this book? Is Vance, just trying to appeal to, the evangelical voter base in advance of him running for president? I honestly found some of those criticisms a little off. I will say that he definitely, is attempting to bring non-Catholic Christians into the conversation and, acknowledges them, writes about positive things that he received in his own upbringing. But at the same time, I think he certainly talks about very Catholic things in this, including the Eucharist, including how in the Catholic Church, the Eucharist, right, our participation sacramentally in the body of Christ is the source of communio. So there is also that spiritual dimension of community too. At the end of the book, he talks about, the community of saints, which is greater than any sort of national communion as well. So I think that honestly is the thing I'm most interested in exploring further, is this kind of tension or relation between political community and how Christianity is conducive to that, but then also the broader spiritual communion, which is the church, which of course transcends any political allegiance. So I think Vance does, he certainly includes both dimensions in this book, but I think thinking about how those actually work in tandem, practically speaking, is definitely a question a lot of people will have going forward.
It sounds like a deep thinking book. Is it, Jonathan? And spoiler alert, do you like it?
Well, I think to answer the first question, I think, as you know, Vance he's a very smart guy. He went to Yale Law. He's very well versed in all kinds of topics from theology to philosophy and economics. I think it's written in an extremely accessible way. He is, I've heard someone describe him as first and foremost a writer. When he went to Iraq as a member of the Marine Corps, he wasn't on the front lines. He was writing for the Marine Corps as a journalist, basically. He's had a blog before. He's written books before. So he knows how to write, and he knows how to write in a compelling way. So yeah, there are big ideas, but it is very narrative driven. It's his personal story. There are lots of anecdotes you learn along the way. So in that sense, I think I like it as it is a pretty compelling portrayal of one man's sort of loss of faith and how he came back to it. And of course, he's not alone in that. We're experiencing, significant religious disaffiliation in the United States right now. And Vance says, maybe my experience has something to offer. And then I think on the bigger and broader question, I'm certainly interested in questions of political philosophy and how Catholicism interacts with our life as American citizens. And I think Vance has given us a lot to think about, while also maybe not answering all the questions he raises. So I certainly, enjoyed grappling with that and trying to almost guess where he might be leading the conversation.
Yeah, real quick final question. So as I recall, Hillbilly Elegy was turned into a movie, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Absolutely.
Do you expect this one will become a movie? And if it is, who will play Usha?
That's two very difficult questions.
That's a quick question, Matthew.
It's maybe harder to. It could be part two to Hillbilly Elegy. So who will play Usha? I don't know that question. I'll have to take a look at the possible candidates. But if they want me to be a consultant,
who will play J.D., right?
Consultant, yeah, exactly. Maybe himself, probably not.
All right. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for this. And all of us should be reading your review before we read this book because of your analysis.
Thanks so much.
Well, you're listening to Register Radio here on EWTN Radio. Next up, Shannon Mullen and I are going to celebrate the legacy of American Catholics in the life of the country. Stay tuned here on EWTN Radio.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
And welcome back. I'm Matthew Bunson here, as always, with Shannon Mullen, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register. As we all know, or should know, this year is America's semi-quincentennial. In other words, it is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of the country. So as the nation celebrates, the Register is making this and marking this great moment by celebrating the Catholic legacy and the role that Catholics are going to continue to play in the life of America. So I'm so happy that as an institution, sort of the newspaper of record on the Catholic side, that we're able to mark this really important moment in the life of the country.
Yeah, and I'm very happy that you were able to contribute a major piece to it, our cover piece, 5 Heroes of American Catholicism. I wish we were on video because I'd love to share the cover. It's
gorgeous.
It looks like superheroes, the 5, and it's a great piece. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. It's fun, if we can, to reflect on some of these figures because we forget that they're flesh and blood. They have sort of legendary names, like Junipero Serra, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, John Carroll, Mother Cabrini. I mean, the list is, we'll cover those, I know, but at the same time, this is also an opportunity for us just to reflect on the simple faith of average Catholics who lived, in many cases, immigrated here under very difficult conditions, made a life for themselves and their families. And if we want a living testimony of how that works in practice, all we have to do is look at Robert Francis Prevost, Pope Leo XIV.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I think one of the themes as we approach this big anniversary is the Catholic history, the American Catholic history, that a lot of us don't know. And that's because the textbooks, the social studies books, the history texts that we used in our schools, even if we went to Catholic schools,
That's right,
kind of left out the Catholic stuff. St. Augustine, Florida, being the oldest city in the United States, founded by Catholic explorers and missionaries. The first martyr on American soil being in Kansas in the in the 16th century. A lot of those details, by the way, come from your book, excellent book, the U.S. Catholic Encyclopedia.
Yep.
Which is
a privilege to write.
Wow, so much that we don't know, so I really wanted we wanted to encourage people to know at least some of these figures, and you. It must have been very hard to pick five, but you
just five, yes, yeah. I mean, we could easily pick 100.
Yeah.
But if we start with five, it's in some ways they cover the gamut. So you can really start with Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the member of the great Maryland family of the Catholics. Let's remember that Maryland was founded as sort of a Catholic haven. But even more than just a Catholic haven, it was a place where all religions were welcome. So in other words, the great anti-Catholic bias, the hostility toward Catholics that you found in almost every other aspect of the British colonies did not exist in Maryland, but that didn't mean that it was an exclusively Catholic enclave. The act of toleration and the fact that out of this environment of renewed hostilities once the Calverts were sort of overthrown, that families like the Carrolls were still able to flourish and to give to America a figure like Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who is famously the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's the longest lived. He died last. But also who made sort of Catholicism politically and socially acceptable, A, because of the wealth and influence of the family, but also just because of his sheer willingness to defend the faith publicly and so articulately.
Yeah, there must have been tremendous pressure on him to assimilate into sort of the Protestant ethos. He didn't. That's really interesting. I knew that he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, the only Catholic signer. I didn't realize he was as wealthy as he was. He was kind of like the Donald Trump and Elon Musk of Maryland,
exactly,
anyway.
Yes.
But he was fabulously wealthy.
Right.
Right.
And in a way...
in which case, he had in some ways the most to lose
and that,
materially.
You make a really important point, Shannon, because one of the reasons that he became sort of acceptable to the Continental Congress, the very hostile anti-Catholics who were serving in the Continental Congress, was they realized, okay, he's here with us. He has a lot to lose if this revolution does not succeed. And I think that's part of his legacy, and his great cousin, John Carroll, the first Archbishop of Baltimore, his great struggle was to convince Americans that Catholics could be both good Americans and good citizens and actually still be Catholic. Because there was always this, all the way up to John F. Kennedy. And in some ways you still hear that. There has to be some divided loyalty. You have to choose between America and the Pope, was always this argument. And I think Charles Carroll, John Carroll, they fought this and really paved the way for Catholics to be accepted in wider American culture.
Yeah, and you see that tension, by the way, in J.D. Vance, right?
That's right. Yeah, how good a Catholic can he actually be if he's going to serve in public office?
Yeah, Charles Carroll I knew a little bit about. John Carroll less than that, and I was fascinated by him also. We don't have time to get into it, but he was a close friend of Benjamin Franklin.
That's right.
Which is so interesting. Some of these others, though, Junipero Serra. Tell me why he made your five.
Well, if we look at North America, when we think of America, we think of the whole of the continent. And Junipero Serra was one of those great heroes in establishing the faith in what became California, establishing El Camino Royal, this great chain of missions that stretched across California, and bringing the faith, but then also standing up and defending the indigenous peoples and native peoples in California and beyond. And I thought it was also really important to include him, because he was canonized on American soil by Pope Francis in 2015. I had the great joy of being at Catholic University when it was done by Pope Francis. But the slander and the maligning of Junipero Serra and the whole of that effort at evangelization and bringing souls to Christ, I think it's important to honor him, but also then to keep reminding people of what actually happened in history and what his motivations were. And this idea of him as some hostile, evil colonizer, where they were tearing down his statues not that many years ago. It's a reminder to us that we also have to be able to defend the faith. It goes back to that same question of what it is like to be a Catholic in America, and can you be?
Yeah, what he accomplished is just amazing in any age, let alone the frontier days.
That's right,
the wilderness of California. Let's go to the next one. Mother Cabrini.
Yeah, the patron saint of immigrants who sailed back and forth across the Atlantic 24 times despite an absolute dread of water, of traveling at sea. And one of the great stories of somebody who was determined to do what she could to bring the faith, to help those most in need, in this case, the immigrants by the millions who had come to the United States, Italians in particular. And if we look for one of those great threads, you can see the care for those who were in most need under very difficult circumstances. I mean, she arrived with next to nothing, met only discouragement on the part of much of the institutional church here, and then gave her life to the immigrants here, all with the support of the popes, Pope Leo XIII in particular. And for us as a role model, how to care for those who find their way to this country but doing it properly.
Yeah, and she, along with Elizabeth Ann Seton, is also tell the story of the Catholic Church's contributions to education in this country, to healthcare, to hospitals.
The most vulnerable and those in need, yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. And then we get to...
the Colossus.
Yeah, the Colossus. In some ways, you could make a case that he's kind of the quintessential American Catholic, which is Fulton Sheen.
Yeah.
And what do we have to say about him in this?
Well, we have to say, I think, is in an age in which we are drowning in communication in so many different ways, Sheen understood how to use all the means of communication, social communication, to proclaim the gospel, to turn it into an instrument not to be feared, but to be utilized to convert, so to speak, how we communicate in a language that the modern world can understand, and that he anticipated the Second Vatican Council. But also just the sheer command he had of the faith, but then be able to bring it down to the level that anyone could understand. There are reasons why his TV show had 35 million viewers every year back in the 1950s, why his radio show had an audience of millions, including many, many Protestants who tuned in every week to hear him. And then we can't forget, and I think this is one of the biggest takeaways, that yes, he was articulate in evangelizing, he knew how to communicate, but he was also holy. He did an hour of adoration every day of his life and died in the middle of adoration. So these are great figures.
Yeah, we're going to come back to him in a few months.
Yes, we are.
And talk about your own connection to Fulton Sheen. But it's also so interesting because in what you just spoke about, we see parallels with EWTN's own Mother Angelica.
That's right. A great communicator.
Yeah, and not only that, but some of the other evangelical preachers who really were able, Billy Graham and others who were able to use the mass media to spread the good news.
Well, in talking about the media, we have to be sure to talk about how we fared at the Catholic Media Association. So please, take it away.
Yes, I'm happy to report this was the Catholic Media Conference, which is held annually. This year was in Atlantic City in New Jersey. And I have to say, they did a really great job, and we were very honored at EWTN. We won across our platforms more than 70 awards on the TV side and the print side. The Register won Newspaper of the Year, National Newspaper of the Year, which is
a great achievement for you as editor-in-chief.
Yeah, we're very happy at that. And then really roughly half of the entries that we submitted won first place. 12 in total won first place in different writing categories. And that's a testament to our great staff, and they're doing different stories, and was really, really proud of them.
Yeah. Well, congratulations to everyone. This is an immense achievement for EWTN and EWTN News in particular.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for Register Radio for this week. Remember, for more news, analysis, and commentary, check out the National Catholic Register online at ncregister.com. Thanks so much for being here. Until next week, on behalf of our producer, Michael McCall and Shannon Mullen, I'm Matthew Bunson. Take care, and God bless.